Senior business leaders and political figures assembled at Asia House in London for the ASEAN Dialogue, a programme designed by Asia House to drive economic and political engagement between Europe and Asia. A delegation of 25 ASEAN business leaders, ranging from banking, airlines, manufacturing, property, infrastructure and professional services, attended the packed event at the prestigious Asia House in central London. Organised in partnership with CIMB ASEAN Research Institute, the ASEAN Business Club and supported by Kroll, the high-level discussions were opened by the UK's Secretary of State for Business, Innovation and Skills, Sajid, Javid.
It's a stunningly embarrassing statistic that Britain still does more trade with Belgium than the whole of Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore and Vietnam combined. But it doesn't have to be this way. In the last 30 years, the UK has successfully attracted a wide range of world-leading overseas-owned companies that are now fully embedded in the UK business community.
As someone who once worked as a banker in the region, Sajid Javid urged UK business to get involved in ASEAN.
Last year, the top 25 UK companies already in Malaysia represented some 70,000 Malaysian jobs, and the number is growing by the day. I want there to be many, many more success stories just like that across ASEAN.
The ASEAN delegation at the conference was led by Nazir Razak, chairman of CIMB Group and recipient of this year's Asia House Asian Business Leaders Award. Taking part in a lively session on the politics of the region, he welcomed the drive towards the ASEAN Economic Community, but says it's a work in progress.
We've accepted that by the end of this year, when we launch AAC 2015, it ain't going to be the single production base, right? Free movement of skilled labor, etc., etc. It's not going to be that. But it's going to be another big, decisive step forwards. And it is irreversible now, the momentum for economic integration.
It is our belief that the Philippines will continue to be a bright spot in Southeast Asia, will remain so beyond the current administration and amid the more open environment of the ASEAN economic community.
Despite that, economic inequality in the region is predicted to be a hurdle to further integration.
The disparities within the region are that 600 million people in the region, 10% of them still live on less than $1 a day. 60 million people live in extreme poverty. 2/3 of those live in Indonesia alone. The largest single block of economic actors in the region. And we've got to be able to convince all our ASEAN colleagues, all our ASEAN nations, fellow citizens, that moving forwards with further integration will actually benefit everyone.
And Nazir Razak gave his view on the crisis engulfing politics in his own country, Malaysia.
We need to establish the National Consultative Council to discuss and debate a better way forward for Malaysia. On that table should be sensitive issues like the regional social contract, like affirmative action, etc., etc., which we did in 1970, post the May 69 riot. 8 months later, we established the National Consultative Council 1, and all these issues were discussed. And I'm saying that it's time to do it again.
But the session also heard a warning from Richard Daly of Kroll on the continuing problems with corruption in parts of ASEAN.
Corruption still is the overriding problem for businesses operating in Indonesia. And of course, you may have read recently that there are now moves afoot to actually limit the power of the Anti-Corruption Commission, the KPK. Well, this is quite a step back.
At a later session on two-way investment, panellists were questioned further by the audience on the issue of local corruption. AirAsia CEO Tony Fernandes said companies going into the region need to have ethical business practices as well.
Obviously, I think it takes two to tango. And I've seen it in many industries where foreign companies are engaging agents, are actually encouraging some of this corruption. So I think good governance starts with the companies who are coming in as well.
But he was upbeat when questioned how technology could transform business, big and small.
And I really believe the growth in ASEAN is going to come from SMEs and private entrepreneurs. So really, that capital that Munir mentioned is so critical, and I think the internet is a fantastic way of breaking down conventional ways of doing things. You know, at AirAsia, we use the internet to build an airline.
In the same session, there were strong messages on two-way investment with ASEAN.
This world is moving very, very quickly. We mentioned speed before. We have a philosophy internally now, which is innovate or die. I'm afraid I believe that's where the West is. We have to innovate very quickly. We have to get our case across very quickly. So therefore, we must communicate very, very well with the ASEAN bloc.
I think some people in the UK don't quite understand the inward investment agenda. I think they've mixed it up with many other, perhaps slightly more negative stories. And I think it's incumbent on everybody to keep explaining this is really great for Britain. Without this, we wouldn't have X, Y, and Z, and the list I've just said on Bassi. So we've got to bang that drum very hard internally to make sure people don't misinterpret what inward investment really means.
Trade and investment are extremely closely intertwined. Many companies are led to invest through their experience of exporting to a market, their experience of understanding how that market works, of working with partners in that market, and realizing the opportunities which are available to them.
The morning also included a session looking at the massive infrastructure needed in the region.
This is an economy of 625 million people with a huge demographic dividend, 30% of population under 30. We absolutely see it has the potential to replace China as the world's manufacturer by 2030. And it really does already have an ease of doing business, which is much better than any of the BRIC countries. And the level of investment already is much higher from the US than all the BRIC countries combined. That's why you've got to believe that there's a way of cracking the infrastructure challenge.
And ASEAN needs something like 60 billion US dollars per year of infrastructure. What sectors? The main sectors are essentially you're looking at power generation and roads. So between power generation and roads, you have a 62% of infrastructure need covered.
Much needs to be done quickly, but it needs to be thoughtful because we have a one-generation opportunity to build infrastructure that will be there for many generations. It would be remiss of ASEAN nations to follow Western models because the situation the world finds itself in is very different today.
After a busy morning, delegates had plenty of time for networking before the afternoon began with a look at financial services, in particular regulatory reform, in partnership with the advisory firm Globel Counsel and supported by Prudential. Unveiling a new report, ASEAN Insurance Markets, Integration, Regulation and Trade, Donald Kanak of the Prudential highlighted the differences in the region.
Singapore at over $50,000 per capita GDP, and Cambodia of around 1,100. So 46 times difference. So as we talk about convergence, we talk about regulatory development, I mean, we're talking about an extraordinary degree of diversity.
I think you have to recognize also that each of the ASEAN countries, aside from being diverse in terms of, let's say, levels of development, we all have our different rules and regulations. And I think this has been recognized in the negotiations towards, for example, in services, etc.
I'd probably argue that today ASEAN represents one of the single best banking opportunities in the universe today. It's probably within the top 4 or 5 strategic priorities of most financial institutions. So whether you're a global player, a regional player, or a domestic player, you're all very interested by the dynamics that ASEAN provides for. And if you look at the dynamics, they're very clear. What history tells you is that GDP and trade since 1990 have grown by a factor of 7 and 8 times respectively.
During the session, former EU Trade Commissioner Lord Mandelson described his own enthusiasm for ASEAN as a trading partner, and he praised it as an important grouping.
But ASEAN itself is a recognition by the Southeast Asian states of their strength, both in openness and in integration. It's an important sort of stake in the ground in both those respects.
Amongst lively questions from the audience afterwards, Lord Mandelson was asked if he thought Britain might leave the EU. The former EU Trade Commissioner raised what he thought would be a difficult trade issue for the UK.
Having left the European Union, we would then have to renegotiate all the free trade agreements that currently exist between the European Union and the rest of the world, because that will be a sort of 2 to 10-year process.
After that, it was left to the UK's trade envoy to ASEAN, Richard Graham MP, to sum up the day.
So I think the important thing today is you've had some great speakers. I know you've exchanged some great ideas. You've also had the benefit of Peter Mandelson talking about Scotland and the European Union, which perhaps wasn't on the formal agenda. And it's all happening here at Asia House.
As part of the programme, later in the day, the 25-strong ASEAN Business Club delegation, led by Nazir Razak, visited number 10 Downing Street. There they met with the Commercial Secretary to the Treasury, Lord O'Neill, to discuss bilateral trade. The UK-ASEAN Dialogue 2015, part of the Asia House programme to drive economic and political engagement between Europe and Asia.